Hello again. This is part 3 of the 3-part lecture series for Module 5 on alcohol. We have already talked about alcohol and its absorption and elimination in the body, the acute and chronic effects of alcohol, and for lecture 3, we'll be talking about alcohol use and misuse. So alcohol use would just be the sort of non-problematic use of alcohol by someone. Some people call it social drinking or drinking in moderation, but there are a lot of vague definitions. So what does it mean to drink in moderation? What does it mean to drink socially? At least with moderation, we'll talk about in a minute, there's some agreement about what that means, but drinking socially really is open to the individual's interpretation. So some people might say socially, and that means they go out with a friend every night to happy hour and drink, or some people say socially and they only go out once every 2 months and they black out when they do, right? So social drinking really is a very vague term, but we can talk about moderate drinking and drinking in moderation. Or we can also talk about responsible drinking. So this is a link, and I'll share this through Canvas as well, for tips for responsible drinking from Frostberg. There's a whole website, section of our website dedicated to alcohol information, and low risk drinking is one of those websites. So some tips for low risk drinking would be never drinking alone, eating foods high in protein, both before and during drinking. So again, you'll remember from lecture 1, food in the stomach is the #1 factor that influences the absorption of alcohol. And so the more food in the stomach, the slower the rate of absorption, the better the body's ability to process and handle the alcohol that's coming in. Setting a limit of how much you'll drink to keep your blood alcohol content around the 0.05 range, and keeping track of your drinks and the amount of time that you've been drinking in order to do that. We'll talk in a moment about how do you calculate blood alcohol content. Avoiding pre-mixed drinks with unknown alcohol content, so stay away from the jungle juice, right? So anything that is like in a cooler that's already been made, you have no idea what's in it or how much alcohol is in it. And so it makes it harder to keep track of drinks in order to stay close to that blood alcohol content that you're trying to stay with. And avoiding drinking games, or at the very least, avoiding the actual drinking part of the drinking game. And so there are some strategies if you want to be playing beer pong, but you don't want to be getting too drunk too fast, slowing down how much you're drinking, or playing with water and having drinks on the side, so that you're not actually having to drink the alcohol faster than your body can keep up with it. And there's other tips and strategies on the Frostberg website too. I would recommend checking it out. There's also information there about student conduct and student policy that could be helpful, and we'll talk about that in a moment when we get to kind of consequences of drinking or alcohol misuse. As I said a moment ago, when we're talking about drinking in moderation, the definition for women is 1 drink per day, or 2 drinks per day for men. And there are actually some associated positives of drinking that amount. There's a lower risk of dementia, lower risk of rheumatoid arthritis, lower risk of heart disease, and stroke, which all sound great. But the problem is that drinking 1 drink a day per woman also has associated with a higher risk of breast cancer. And if you drink any more than 1 drink a day or 2 drinks a day, then you start to see negative consequences associated with drinking. And we'll talk about those in a moment. This is a blood alcohol chart. This is off the Frostberg website. And so you see that the chart is separate for men and for women, because we talked about how the absorption of drugs differs for men and women generally. And so you'll see here, let me get my marker. So this column here is the number of alcoholic drinks. And again, this is measured in standard drinks. Hold on, let me get the better marker from WebEx instead of from PowerPoint. Okay, so the number of standard drinks is here. And the body weight of the individual, so this row here are the body weights. And this is then the shaded in areas reflect how impaired you are. So let's say that you weigh 180 pounds and you're a guy and you want to stay around the 0.05 mark, right? In terms of the sort of responsible drinking, the least risky drinking. Then what you're looking at is 2 drinks would put you at that 0.04 level. And that's where you're starting to get some impairment. You cannot be driving safely at that point. You might be illegal to drive, but you're not safe to drive. And down here, it's helpful. It's got the, 1 shot, 12-ounce beer, 4 ounce of wine. So this is 2 standard drinks, puts you at that level of responsible drinking. Now, if you were to consume more than 2 drinks over 40 minutes, then you can start to subtract from this blood alcohol percentage. So let's say you stuck with 1 drink an hour and you were drinking for 4 hours, right? So drinking for 4 hours and you drank 1 drink an hour and you are a 180-pound male, it would be 0.08, 0.08 minus 0.01 for each 40 minutes of drinking. So over 4 hours, that's 4 hours is 4 40-minute periods and then 4 20-minute periods. So that's actually 6. I'm sorry, I'm doing my mental math. So 4 times 60 minutes is 240 minutes divided by 40 minutes is 6. So that's 6 periods of 40 minutes times 0.01 is 0.06. And so that puts you at an intoxication level of 0.02, which is lower than if you drank 2 in 40 minutes. So this is how you calculate your blood alcohol percentage. And you can do this in anticipation of drinking in order to engage in more responsible drinking. On the flip side, you could consume as much alcohol as you wanted in as short a time as you wanted and engage in binge drinking or in moderation. The more alcohol consumed during each drinking session, the more likelihood that mental deficits will develop. That brain impact, your ability of your body to keep up with your alcohol consumption goes down drastically if you're drinking faster than 1 drink an hour. So, for example, drinking 5 drinks in one night compared to drinking 1 glass a night over 5 days. Furthermore, really just anything over 3 or more drinks a day puts you at significant risk for those parts of the brain to really never fully recover. And so your lecture question for this module is based on what we talked about a moment ago, which was that, well, if you're a woman and you drink 1 drink a day and you're a guy and you drink 2 drinks a day, there's all these health benefits that people are finding. But if you drink 3 or more, you're looking at serious brain damage and long-term brain damage. So there's a fine line between moderation and immoderation. And so the question for you to reflect on and answer in the lecture question this week is alcohol consumption a double-edged sword? And what is the evidence that, it is prudent and a good idea to drink on a regular basis? And what's the evidence that it's not a good idea? And how do you make sense of that? How do you reconcile that? What would you end up choosing based on this information? Consumption of alcohol over time also, like with any substance, leads to tolerance. And again, tolerance might be the most well known in terms of alcohol, where the first thing that comes to mind is someone who has a high alcohol tolerance. It's like, oh, that person can really drink a lot and they don't get drunk. Uh, what actually happens is that the body just gets better at compensating for that alcohol use. So somebody's blood alcohol content who has a high tolerance might be very high, the same amount that it is for someone with a low tolerance, but they're not experiencing the same mental effects than the person who has a low tolerance. Um, and so it's that element, not experiencing the mental effects, that leads someone to drink more so that they can experience the feeling of buzz, they can experience the sensation of euphoria. And then that further reinforces chronic drug use or alcohol use or addiction. Um, and tolerance to some degree can happen after one drinking session. But generally, what happens is it's chronic use over time that leads to the development of tolerance. And because of the body's trying to compensate for chronic ingestion of alcohol, you can see damage to parts of the body based on ramping up and increasing the amount of alcohol consumed, specifically in the liver. And you can get a condition called cirrhosis of the liver. And that's related to just the immense pressure and use that the liver is put through in trying to um, process alcohol and chronic alcohol use. Alcohol dependence develops when alcohol tolerance is experienced and somebody then stops using alcohol. I'm sorry, that's withdrawal, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Dependence is becoming either psychologically or physically dependent on alcohol. Alcoholism itself is uh, classified as a mental illness where the individual engages in alcohol consumption that leads to feelings of lack of control, feeling a craving for alcohol, feeling driven to consume alcohol even when it's causing problems. That's alcoholism or alcohol dependence. Alcohol abuse can be just using alcohol in a problematic way. So patterns of drinking that are causing problems for the person. Um, and it used to be that we talked about those separately, but in the new DSM-5, we now talk about those together. So it's now on a spectrum of alcohol use disorder where you can have alcohol use disorder without having tolerance or withdrawal symptoms if you're just using alcohol in a risky way or in a way that causes problems for you. And this is what I was mentioning before. Withdrawal would be the physical effects on the body of removing alcohol from the system after the body has developed a tolerance to it. And so, generally, withdrawal, what you see is the kind of opposite effect that the drug itself has on the body. That's what then happens with withdrawal. So sweating or increasing the heart rate. So alcohol is a sedative. So the withdrawal symptoms you would expect to see would be excitation of the central nervous system. So increased heart rate, increased tremors and motor stimulation, uh, difficulty sleeping, right? Sedatives put you to sleep. So if you're going through withdrawal, you're having a hard time sleeping. Nausea or vomiting, that's just from the actual digestion of the alcohol through the liver. Hallucinations, again, that overexcitation, overstimulation of the brain, uh, creating the perception of stimulus that aren't there. Psychomotor agitation, that restlessness, anxiety, and then even brain activation, overactive brain activation to the point of seizures. Alcohol withdrawal is the only withdrawal that the withdrawal itself can kill you. No other substance, not even heroin, do the withdrawal symptoms pose a deadly threat. So people who are needing to detox from alcohol have to do it under medical supervision, or they could die just from the process itself. So there are certain risk factors for addiction with alcoholism in particular. We talked about some of them generally for addiction disorders. Really, anyone can become dependent on alcohol with the way it manifests physically in the body. The risk for someone becoming dependent is higher if they're using alcohol for self-medication. So if they're experiencing an anxiety disorder or depression and using alcohol to suppress those emotions and those feelings, then the risk of becoming dependent on it is greater. Um, and then there's, you know, the nature nurture debate exists for alcoholism and alcohol addiction, but truly the answer is always the same. It's both. You can see a genetic link. People who have a first degree family member who's an alcoholic, they are twice as likely to experience alcoholism in their life. There's a big genetic factor here to alcoholism. But it's hard to separate that out because of environmental factors. So, let's say you have a parent who is an alcoholic, they didn't just give you their genetics, they also created an environment that you were raised in that might set you up to be more likely to be an alcoholic. And so the the debate between nature and nurture is complex, but again, the answer is almost always both. And in the case of alcoholism and substance use disorders, that genetic component really does set someone up for a predisposition. And then the environmental factors interact with that on top of that baseline risk. Other factors that influence addiction aside from genetics, you'll see cultural factors. So, is alcohol widely available? How is drinking viewed in that culture? Um, so, in a culture where there is very little alcohol and drinking is viewed as really against the norm, it's not something that people do. You're going to see alcoholism to a lesser degree than in cultures where heavy drinking is normalized and encouraged. There are social factors to consider. So, how much are your friends and family even putting pressure on you to engage in drinking, and how strongly do you want to fit in with those circles? That's going to have an impact on the way that you use alcohol and the pattern of use. And again, those psychological factors. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, people feeling like alcohol is a way to self medicate against the experience of trauma or anxiety or depression, you're going to see an increased risk for addiction in those individuals as well. Um, Men who are sons of alcoholic fathers are far more likely to experience alcoholism, and with chronic use over time of men by with of alcohol by men, they can experience becoming sterile and also impotent. So even alcohol use, even one time to a large enough degree, can cause erectile dysfunction. Again, that suppression of the central nervous system means the go no go transmitters aren't working properly, and so it means the brain can't send signals where it needs to send them in order for men to sustain erections. And over time, it can then start to really damage that process and also the mobility and motility of sperm. And then also this feminization syndrome, the development of some breast tissue and the lowering of testosterone levels with chronic alcohol use by men. Women are more, uh, there's still a lot of stigma around women drinking alcohol to a large degree or getting drunk. Um, it was less acceptable before, it's becoming more acceptable. And with that, you're also seeing increased rates of alcoholism among women as it's become more normalized for women to drink. Um, on the whole, women tend to be smaller with a greater percentage of body fat, and so that means that alcohol is absorbed quicker and more readily. That's why we have separate charts for blood alcohol content. Um, Women who are under 40 in particular have fewer enzymes to break down alcohol in the stomach, and so more gets transferred to the small intestines, which is where it's absorbed quicker. Um, And among women who drink, they're at a greater risk for organ damage and breast cancer than men who drink. And there's also a greater impact on women's cognitive functioning than there is on men. And that's just due to these generalizations related to percentage of body fat and overall size. That, as you remember before, more body mass means that the body alcohol is processed in a slower, more tolerable rate, and women tend to be smaller, and so you tend to see these greater impacts on functioning uh, than you do with men. Alcohol also varies by age. Alcohol use does. It's the drug of choice for high school students. So most high school students who are using some kind of drug are going to report that they're using alcohol. Um, Contrary to like the stereotypes that you see or the way college students are talked about in movies and television or in the media, um, about a quarter of all college students drink no alcohol at all. So that's between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 of your peers at Frostburg are not drinking any alcohol. And then about 40% of people who are drinking, though, are drinking in high risk form. So that means binge drinking. So drinking 5 or more drinks in 1 hour. So it's kind of this polarization, right? It's either no drinking at all is happening or this very high risk style of drinking is happening. And that's why there's information on the Frostburg website about, okay, well, how can we find a middle ground here? What is a more responsible, less risky way to drink alcohol? And that not just for being able to follow along with the conduct policy, student conduct policy, but also just to limit the impact on young adult developing brains. And that's what I'm talking about here. So, in developmental considerations, the brain, and in particular the frontal lobe, which is the most susceptible to long term alcohol damage, is still developing well into the mid 20s. And the impact from binge drinking or chronic heavy use of alcohol, so again, that 3 or more drinks per day, you can start to see a real lasting impact on frontal lobe in terms of things like attention, concentration, planning, decision making, etc. Um, and the earlier drinking starts, there's the greater risk for addiction. It's a correlation that they found. Um, and then, alcohol use can impact education. It's related to, I said a moment ago, it's not just about student conduct, but it is also about student conduct. So alcohol use can get you in trouble through the university. It can get you in legal trouble if you're under 21. It can have an impact on your overall health and also result in injuries or death. I mean, there's also just physical safety issues related to alcohol use. And chronic alcohol use in adulthood is associated with a whole number of things that are you don't really want to be associated with. So things like domestic violence, suicide, sexual assault, violence and aggression, accidental deaths, especially with other substances. We'll talk about that in a moment. Criminal behavior or getting fired from your job. So alcohol has this feature of lowering inhibition. It affects that frontal lobe in a way that takes away our ability to control our impulses or to um, control our behavior when we have a goal in mind. And so, someone who is intoxicated by alcohol and who has a violent thought doesn't have the same behavioral controls that someone who is sober does. And so, you see alcohol playing a role in these types of spontaneous violent acts like domestic violence or sexual assault, even because alcohol is taking away that inhibition. With sexual assault, also, alcohol is the number one date rape drug. So we talk about other drugs like roofies and GHB as being involved in facilitating sexual assault, somebody drugs a woman typically, or it could be anyone. Um, and then that person becomes intoxicated, and the perpetrator then is able to assault them without physical resistance. Alcohol is the first line of date rape drugs that is like the go-to date rape drug for people who want to assault someone, um, which I think is not very well known. So again, I think if you'll think back to either lecture one or lecture two, there's a fine, fine line between alcohol use in a way that feels pleasant, it feels intoxicating, but not to the point of impairment, and alcohol use that is problematic, that ends up hurting the body, ends up hurting the mind, or hurting someone else. And that line is so fine. And there are some ways to help gain control over that, keeping track of your blood alcohol content, remembering those responsible drinking points, but also remembering that the use, it's the nature of the substance itself that creates that fine line between things being okay and things being very wrong. And that's just with alcohol. But then if you add in other drugs, particularly other drugs that depress the central nervous system, it becomes dangerous very quickly. So opiates, tranquilizers, barbiturates, sleep medications, even some antidepressants, all of those things, you stack them up with alcohol, which is already suppressing your neuron functioning in your brain and your spinal cord, and you've got a deadly combo. And all of the drugs that I just mentioned have been implicated in almost every celebrity death that you've read about. So celebrities who are abusing alcohol, they're abusing prescription drugs, they're doing that separately for many years, and then one night they combine them all, and that's when you get celebrity overdose death. Um, and so again, it's that you're doubling up the suppression of the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, the things that make you function and live. If you suppress them enough, then people slip into comas and die. So it's kind of a downer to end on, but I think it's important to consider the toxicity of a substance really impacts the way that it's used, and impacts not just the individual, but people around them. And so that's it for alcohol. And we'll move on to the next module after this.